So today we're happy to have Evan Freund, who's, how long have you been in the church? About a year or something like that? Since like June, so relatively new member. And he's going to talk about the philosophy of science. I'll see if I can remember his... So you went to George Mason University, right?
Yes.
And you did a double major in...
No, it was it's a major in economics and minored in philosophy.
Major in economics, minor in philosophy. And now he is working for...
For Regis. Yes.
All right. In...
It's just in the town center.
Okay, all right. Okay, so anyway, if you have questions...
Or did you mean like the fields? I'm sorry, I meant...
Which field?
Yeah, it's just like the title is like community associate. It's just like an office. It's like I manage like office spaces is like my day job.
Okay, it's day job. His main hobby is philosophy of science, probably. So anyway, he's going to talk about that. If you have questions, you can ask questions during, but you have to wait for the microphone because it's going to be on YouTube later, so we need to get the questions as well. Thank you. Please welcome Evan Freund.
Yes, hello. So today I'm going to give a talk about philosophy of science. I know I'm a bit younger than most of the people giving presentations. I don't have like 20 years of experience, but I do have a blazer, so... Yeah. Okay. So, why philosophy of science? And I will say basically, in the past, philosophy and science weren't always separated. So before, relatively recently, what we would consider science today would have been more a branch of philosophy called natural philosophy, which is about kind of understanding like what the world is like made out of. And so you can see that in a lot of like pre-Socratic philosophy where they had ideas of like different ideas of what the earth is made of. So before we had modern conceptions of elements, certain pre-Socratic philosophers thought, hey, maybe everything is made out of water, or maybe everything's made out of air, or maybe you have like the classical four elements of like fire, water, earth, and air. And that's where that comes from. There's also like, and then metaphysics is somewhat related, where that's also an idea, and I'm simplifying a bit, of kind of how the world works. And before we had like our modern conceptions, a lot of that was like different ideas of like the elements or different mythical ideas of the earth was made by gods, because we didn't have the modern theories of like the Big Bang or like carbon dating. And even back in the day, there were still certain ideas that resembled modern ideas. Like people didn't have an idea of like the planet and relativity, but there was an idea of like a tendency to fall, which could be related to gravity. And then what we think of as science today, I think really started with the Enlightenment, which I think kind of had this emphasis on like empiricism or like study through observation. And that's where it started to kind of be, where science started to disentangle itself from like philosophy and religion, and creating like a modern world where we think of science as something separate. And that's where you also get things like Newtonian physics, which creates a lot of like our modern principles that are still taught in school today. And yeah, and there's also, I would say, an evolution over time from about that era to now, where there is this sort of idea of science as like this, of like being built by like great men, by like individual people, and that did happen with a few people. A lot of the time, like I think Darwin largely studied mostly on his own, and there's a lot of stories about people like doing random stuff in their backyard. I know there's an expression where the difference between fooling around and science is writing it down. So then you had a lot of people like that towards the beginning, but now things are so complex that a lot of modern research, I know some people here are more experienced with like modern research than I am, so they can verify how true this is or not, of how they are. It's a lot more collective now, so there's like teams of people trying to answer these problems instead of individual people like fooling around in their backyard. And over there? Oh. Okay, that worked the first time. There we go. Okay, so I want this slide to be, this can be a little more interactive. So these are some of more contemporary and like some really difficult fundamental questions about science of like, so we think of science as this objective thing, but then what exactly is objectivity? Does anybody have any ideas?
The absence of opinion.
Okay, well that's one thing that you could say.
Something real everybody can agree on.
Well, does everybody agree on science? Measurable? Yeah, that's part of it. Replicable. Yeah, those are all standards that were often used. Yes.
You have facts and evidence to back you up.
Yes, but then how do you decide what's a fact and what's evidence? And that's like kind of, so that's why we have standards like measuring it, and like what would you say again over there? Replication. Yeah, replication. That's one of the things that is used as a standard.
I would say objectivity requires that you try to find what actually is true rather than Objectivity requires trying to find what's actually true rather than trying to cherry pick data to fit what you want to convince people of.
Yes, that is true, and there are. I do know I have bias on another slide, so we'll get back to that as well. And I guess we can move on to something else of a. So what do you? Oh, you have another idea?
Science, and I think of the different kinds of science, botany, chemistry, and I stumbled.
Start again, John. Sorry.
I stumbled. What is political science?
Start again.
Is that a science? Is political science a science?
So I would say every field of science operates a little bit differently, and I would consider political science a social science. And social sciences can be a little harder than some of like the harder sciences like physics, because that's a measure of the behavior of people, and that can be more difficult to measure than just how objects interact with each other.
I guess that was at the heart of my question. How on earth would you measure something political?
Well, I would say with social sciences in general, usually you get groups of people together, and you try to study their behavior on different political systems. So I know I also have a degree in economics, so I can speak to that somewhat, where for that there's a lot of observational studies. So a lot of people will look at the history of books and try to look for stuff that kind of naturally replicates an experiment. So for example, in economics, some of the most famous examples are East and West Germany or North and South Korea, because those are very similar cultures that were very suddenly split into two different systems. So you can use that to sort of replicate an experiment to see which system works better. And for political science, I would say it's generally not as trustworthy as hard science. It's just because I'm not saying these people aren't smart. It's just it's fundamentally harder to measure, because you have to use these observations rather than designing very precise experiments. And then I'll also move on to the next question of like, so another question is what exactly is scientific progress? And then I do have some more slides on that later, so we can go deeper in it later. But just for now, do you have, have anybody ever thought about what progress means exactly?
Well, sorry, could you repeat the questions? Otherwise, I'll have to take the microphone there because can you repeat the question? Or hang on, let me pass the microphone around. It's on video, you see. It's being recorded, so we have to.
Sorry. I was putting forward the accumulation of understanding over time that builds upon itself.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's definitely a good definition.
And rejection of ideas that are demonstrably wrong.
I'm sorry. What?
Rejecting ideas that may be beautiful but are wrong by measurement or observation or experiment.
I mean, yeah, that's true. That's how skepticism works with science, where you try to prove yourself wrong, and then when you can't do that, then you've learned something, right? It's a good idea. But I also say there is like some other fundamental issues with science because at the end of the day, it's performed by people. And because it's performed by people, it's via our own senses and tools that we like make for ourselves. So then that goes back to objectivity, where some of the issues is like what we know of science is not given to us by some sort of outside entity. It's created by our own observations and tools. So then instead of having something completely separate given by like God or something like that, we have to depend on like our own collection of subjective experiences and try to parse out what's objective from that. And that's sort of a fundamental issue when trying to achieve objectivity with our understanding of the world. And yeah, I guess move on to the next one. Now, what exactly is a theory? So another interesting thing about science and like progress is that we think of this as this objective thing, but a lot of things that we think of objective one period of time are disproven, and the theories change over time. So, like, has anyone here ever heard of phlogiston? Yeah. So phlogiston was an older theory of how the Earth works. So before the periodic table was like definitive, this was like a competing theory with it, and it was based on an alternative theory of how things work. And it's basically, I'm not an expert in it, but I just know it's an old theory that people used to believe in. And you can, there is a diagram there I put there where it's like an alternative theory of chemistry. You can look more into it if you want to, where there would be things that are like rich with phlogiston that are, I think, would be like lighter, and things are heavier that don't have as much in it. And I'm not an expert in it, but the broader point is that it is a theory. Sorry. The broader point is that it is a theory that's an alternative to our modern theory of chemistry. So then what we take to be objective can often change. And then even it can be circular because since they're competing theories, you can still technically do stuff based off of the theory of phlogiston. So it could be so, in principle, that data could accumulate, and that proves an alternative theory like phlogiston more correct again than our current theory of the elements. And then we can go in a loop, and that brings into question how trustworthy our current understanding of the world is and how exactly far progress has brought us. And then also know there is a famous book that I had to read for my philosophy of science class that I took called like The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and that is a very influential book about sort of the structure of how scientific theories evolve over time. And I know one of the principles of that is that there are certain, like this is where the term paradigm comes from. And sort of the idea is that there is certain paradigms, say like phlogiston, that becomes prominent within the scientific community. But then over time, an alternative theory builds more and more evidence until there is a crisis where a new paradigm is born. So say there is the phlogiston as a theory, and then a person has this alternative theory of the periodic table of elements. And over time, data accumulates showing that seems more trustworthy than the other one. Oh, thank you. And then a new paradigm is born. Thank you. And a new paradigm is born. And this basically process. Yes, do you have a question?
Question? Glenn?
I think that we call it scientific progress if it enables us to predict things correctly.
My frustration sometimes occurs when someone in my scientific group likes to make fun of Aristotle for talking about how the heavier object falls faster than the lighter object. And I remember that Aristotle wasn't dealing with a vacuum-free or a vacuum universe. He was dealing with an atmosphere, and he could see things fall. And in many cases, the lighter thing falls more slowly than the heavier one. So his observations were sort of true. They weren't completely true, but he did pretty well for somebody who did all of this in 400 BC or whatever it was. But it bothers me because what changed for him was the fact that the assumption you needed to do this measurement or calculation in a vacuum to find out what was really true in most of the universe. He didn't do that. He didn't have the tools to do that. But he still takes a lot of grief because of it. He's sort of discredited because of his theory that the heavier thing falls faster than the lighter one.
Well, I will
Yeah,
say,
but he could have dropped two stones, one a small stone and one a big stone, and seen they dropped it. So it's not a question of weight, it's more a question of density.
They might have ended up pretty much the same depending on
Yeah.
the size of
I mean, yeah, I mean, I'll also say that, yeah, you should be more forgiving of people from 2,000 years ago because they didn't have the tool. They didn't know what a vacuum was.
That's right.
And yeah, and a lot of the theories, like, they make sense for the time. Like, I'm an atheist today, but I think if I was born 2,000 years ago, then a lot of the mythical stories could make more sense to me than some of the deity ones, if that makes sense. And you can see in a lot of, in that time there was like the natural philosophy, and that was full of a lot more basic things, like people thinking the earth was made out of air or water instead of all these elements. And at the time that made sense. And today the difference is we have all these extra measurements and theories that we go by. And then, so there's that, yeah. But yeah, and I also know, yeah, and then with the scientific revolutions thing, I do know because of that, the idea of the scientific paradigms, it doesn't necessarily have to progress linearly, which can call into question exactly how much progress we might be making. And then I'm going to move on to the next slide. Now, I usually go through presentations pretty quickly, so there should be a lot of time for questions at the end as well. Then I have bias. So this is another issue with human beings doing science, is that, as I think most people are probably aware of now, is that there can be a lot of bias in what we do, even if we try to get rid of it and to be as neutral as possible. It still tends to bleed through, and sometimes it even is there when it's pretty obvious. So, for example, historically, in a lot of Western science, there has been a bias towards people who look like me, are generally people studied in the data groups, and that means that people of other genders and ethnicities, the data might not be as reliable for them, which has implications for, say, medicine and how effective that can be. And because, let's say, like talked about the Enlightenment earlier, that is usually, a pretty European perspective, because it's about all of these, there was like Descartes, and those Enlightenment thinkers. That's usually a pretty European narrative. But, there are people all over the world, and they all are curious about things. So it's important to keep in mind that they were not the only ones doing these things. And like I mentioned earlier, I talked about Greeks. There are other cultures as well in the world that were doing things, and that's so important to keep in mind so that we don't have a perpetual European bias. I know in the Middle Ages, there was the golden age of Islam, I think, in the 10th or 11th century, and China had a lot more technological advancement than Europe for a long time. So science is not just a history of, Europe. It's been connected throughout the world, and it still is today. And there's also been, there's a modern issue where sometimes a lot of science today obviously requires funding, and that can be coming from questionable sources that can create conflicts of interest. So I know a lot of studies are funded by, the past few decades have been funded by tobacco and oil companies, which are not ideal to have, as I think most of us would agree. And that's where a lot of that, what people might consider propaganda comes from. Interesting with Exxon, their scientists did clearly predict climate change, so they knew what they were doing. They just tried to hide it. And like I mentioned earlier before, even without those issues, we're still people. And anybody making this studies, as hard as we might try, is going to have some kind of bias. And when you're thinking really hard about how to get it out, it can be hard to be perfectly neutral. And of course, there's also, I put the quote, lies, damn lies, and statistics, because a lot of the times there can be really good science, but the way it's communicated can construe it to mean something it's not, or something or you can bend things to basically push whatever narrative you want if you frame it the right way. I know there's the classic thing with graphs where you don't start at 0, so it looks bigger than you think it is. It's one example. And this is obviously very common in politics, where people take studies for whatever they want it to be. And then they say, hey, a study said this, but it's just one study versus all the peer-reviewed data, the autism thing, like vaccines causing autism. So that was a study, although it has since been discredited by the broader scientific community, and it was also just one study. But there are many things similar to that where people can say, hey, I read a study and it said this, and it seems scientific, even though the consensus says otherwise, or there might have been issues with that study design that weren't caught. And so that's always important to keep in mind, and that's, I think, part of why science in modern day people maybe have less trust in, because people consider it to be all sorts of things, so people just stop trusting anything at all. And then, slide. And also, since I'm at a church, I wanted to add a slide about how science interacts with religion a bit. So, science and religion, I mean, since I am kind of somewhat focused on the West, I will say I do know more of the history of like Christianity with science. So I know they've had a bit of a tenuous relationship, because oftentimes what's scientific theories have kind of conflicted with official church narratives. Famously, the idea that I think that's a picture of Galileo's trial, because famously he said the earth revolves around the sun, which contradicted the narrative at the time that the sun revolved around the earth, and he got into a lot of trouble for that during his lifetime. But at the same time, there have been plenty of Christian scientists that have justified their work in the sense with the idea that by having a greater understanding of the world is God, therefore by having a greater understanding of the world, you're bringing yourself closer to God. So it can go either way. And also today, I think sometimes it's a bit strenuous, but there are some people who look for scientific explanations in the Bible, like I forget exactly where I heard this, but I think I heard someone say it once of Jesus turning water into wine. Like there might have been some grapes lying around with the way they store stuff, or just the way the water was stored at the time. It was there was a plausible scientific explanation, or there might have been some sort of natural phenomenon that let Moses part the sea and things like that. And then what I also would like to sort out that there is, it's not just Christianity. There are other cultures that do have very different ideas about what constitutes science and objectivity, and you can see that around the world. So I think Buddhism has a bit of a different structure, where there was, I think sometimes in the West there's the idea that things are built. So if I make a diagram, there's stuff built on top of each other in a linear way. So you have one idea, and you take this idea and you build on from another one, and onto another one, and onto another one, and there's this string. Versus in other cultures, they might have more of an idea where you have a bunch of different things, and then you try to see what matches between them to find out what's the objective truth. I know that might be a little confusing, but it's just the idea that when you interact with different areas of the world, they can come up with some slightly variations on how we think of things, and that can interact with how we do scientific experiments. And that's where that conflict can kind of come from. So that's a bit of the idea. So I just put that clip because I knew that was a pretty famous clip. And then I think it's the last slide I have, where I wanted to end it positively, where I think the strongest idea of modern science and scientific progress is just that we have had a great deal of technological advancement that has been kind of built on our scientific understanding of the world, such that we have nice things like vaccines and phones and space travel and utilities and statistics don't always go in like the way we want them to, but we generally have over time a greater ability to manipulate the world as we get a greater understanding of how things work. And that's, I think, the power of like science and why it's worth preserving as an institution and trying to do stuff with. And that would be, and that's my last slide. So, yes.
Thank you very much, Evan. Very interesting. We have time for some questions. If we have, David.
This is more of a comment related to the Aristotle thing, but we can really only come up with a theory to describe things that we can measure in some way that are maybe in the middle of a very long curve. And if you get really to extremes of that curve, it may be impossible to even speculate what happens there. One example of that is the Aristotle problem, where he was just looking at things that are kind of medium density and didn't have a vacuum to test in. But when you get into physics, then things like approaching what we consider a singularity, if they exist, there are going to be small factors in your equations that you couldn't even see when you're in a more medium density situation. And so everything we have theorized is really just fitting data over a range that we can actually observe, and there could be a lot more to it.
Yeah, I'd say that is an issue where like we can only like measure what we can interact with. So like you said with Aristotle before, a lot of our understanding of space, for example, has to come from what we can see with a telescope. And like we measure it from there, and we can never really know. We can't go inside a black hole and see what's there. We can't go to the edge of the universe to see if the laws of physics changed or something. So that's definitely a thing. And with and there are certain things where we have a limited understanding based on our surroundings. Then as we get better, more sophisticated tools and understanding, our understanding can improve. For example, Newtonian physics is less reliable than general relativity, but it works essentially the same when you're at the scale of observing things on Earth. So that's one example.
There's another example of a beautiful physical idea that turned out to be incorrect. It was Fred Hoyle's steady-state model of the universe. He had what he called a perfect cosmological principle. So generally, space is the same everywhere in the universe and at time and at all times. And then we discovered that actually there was. We learned about the expansion of the universe coming back from the Big Bang. And he tried to revive his idea of a steady-state theory by inventing the appearance of a new hydrogen atom every cubic meter or so every 100 years and so on. But so he was reluctant to give up his beautiful idea, but in the end he just had to, in the light of the evidence that was overwhelming, that the universe started out as so-called Big Bang, which was actually tiny and not really a bang because nobody was there to hear it, except for God, maybe heard it. But, other comments, questions or comments? Sterling.
I think the concept of miracle has been watered down significantly.
Of miracle?
Yeah, because I saw on your slide, everything's a miracle. I mean, curing diseases, yes, I mean, we can consider that a miracle. But, so everything's a miracle that we can't, that's amazing. The other day, I drove from my house to this church. I have 8 traffic signals that I go through, and that was the first time in 20 years that everyone was green. Do I consider that a miracle? I think, to me, a miracle is when the laws of physics are altered like in the Bible when Jesus, for example, cured somebody on the spot. I think that would be a miracle to me. Or if he really dictated and controlled the weather and caused a storm to cease, that would be a real miracle to me. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out because I know people use that term pretty loosely.
Well, actually, I think that is an interesting point because I think that's one of the benefits of science is because it's so great that there has just been so many miracles in the past few hundred years that these massive leaps forward have become mundane and expected. So, like, just vaccines is one example. Before we had vaccines, there would just be like a plague every few decades and people would die, and that's just the way things worked. And then we had vaccines and now that stopped happening, well, more or less, but...
Don't worry, they'll be back.
Well, yeah. There's some issues, but generally speaking, a lot of the issues that have gone away, a lot of the diseases that used to plague us have gone away. Let's say, you say, we'll control the weather. We can't do that entirely, but cloud seeding is a thing that we can alter the weather, and we have a greater understanding of the environment so that we can alter things to make them better, say by... I know there's been some efforts to green the Sahara, or just like flight. That's a miracle. We can literally. People used to think that would be impossible. Now we have airplanes, and we can talk to each other across. We can travel across the world in less than a day. We can talk to somebody in China. We can communicate with them in like seconds. These are all miracles.
Caroline.
To me.
Just an offshoot. This really doesn't relate to your talk, but we're talking about miracles, and it reminded me of this PBS series from the 90s called From Jesus to Christ. You guys have seen it? Yeah. So interesting. It's basically all the scientific evidence there is around the time of Christ, what is actually known. And the funny thing is, at that time, there were teachers coming up, prophets all the time, and performing miracles was a dime a dozen. Everybody performed miracles. That was not unique about Jesus. What was different about him was his miracles didn't always work, and he got tired. He got worn out. One time he had to perform it twice because it didn't take the first time. Yeah, so this is the idea of, they point to Christ as kind of the beginning, in some ways, of democracy, because people were starting to feel like an average person was important to God. Yeah, so anyway, it's like...
Yeah, along those lines, if we can carry on. So there's a very good historical novel called The Sins of Jesus by Richard Muller.
He never sinned.
The Sins of Jesus. Well, in this historical novel, his sin was using deception to perform miracles. So in the story, between the ages of 14 or so and 30, when we don't know what happened to Jesus, he went to Egypt, he learned magic, he learned healing, he learned magic tricks. And a good magician can perform amazing things. His sin was using these miracles to get people to listen to his message of universal love. We should all love each other. And because he could do these miracles, they started believing, taking that. But about miracles, I gave a talk, one of the Science Sunday talks here about the miracles of physics. And if I may mention one, it's, we know we made of carbon. Carbon is the only element that allows complex molecules like proteins and so on. But carbon didn't come from the Big Bang. The Big Bang produced hydrogen, helium, a bit of lithium, but no carbon. And Fred Hoyle said, how come there's so much carbon in the world? And it's hard to make carbon out of helium, because you've got to get 3 helium nuclei to stick together to make carbon. And when 2 stick together, they fall apart in 10 to the minus 17 seconds. It's beryllium-8, it's very unstable. So the 3rd helium has to arrive at that pair before it decays. And the only reason he said that could happen is because carbon has an internal excitation energy of 7.6 million electron volts. It wasn't known, but he asked a physicist, experimenter, to look for that, and they found that. And that is a miracle, in my opinion, because it's a balance between the repulsive electrical force between all the protons, the 6 protons flying apart by electrical repulsion, and sticking together by the strong force. So it's a balance between the strong attractive force and the electrical repulsive force. And that is, for me, one of the miracles that allows carbon to exist. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So anyway, more comments or questions from anybody? There's another miracle how hydrogen exists, but that's another miracle, in my opinion. So anyway, okay, Dan, you have one more comment?
I'm sort of missing part of the discussion in terms of the fact that mathematics has made the big difference in the understanding of the world because of random processes and the progress we've made in the last 100 or 200 years in terms of using mathematics to understand a random process, which apparently has no what do I want to say, no deliberate cause and effect that you can measure. It has this statistical properties that you can use to quantify a random process like weather or communications. I mean, when you look at a GPS signal with a spectrum analyzer, you can't see it. It just looks like the noise floor. But if you do a correlation process on this noisy signal, you can pull it right out. It's really amazing. It's part of the miracle of science, is the mathematics.
Okay,
Yeah.
Bob. Maybe a final comment?
I have a quote.
Hold it close to your mouth.
Oh, talking to the microphone. Okay. Well, I have I remember a quote from the Dalai Lama, the current Dalai Lama, who said, when there is a conflict between religion and science, then religion must change.
Well done, Dalai Lama. Thank you for both. Okay, well, let's thank Evan again for a very nice talk. Thank you.